Sabah al khair, good morning, dear listeners. You're listening to Radio 3CR on 855 AM and Palestine Remembered with Robert Martin, Nasser Mashni, and Yusuf Ahmed al-Rimawi.
Palestine Remembered is Australia's only English-language radio program that is totally dedicated to Palestine. We'd like to welcome those listening on 855 and those that will join us on podcast at 3cr.org.au.
Thanks for joining us. Stay with us and enjoy the episode.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for tuning in to 3CR and Palestine Remembered, and reminding our listeners that this is Australia's only dedicated radio show to Palestine. This morning I'm coming to you live the day before we commemorate Invasion Day, and a very important day for the Indigenous First Nations people, but also all of their supporters, and understand that we're living on land that was never ceded, stolen land, and no treaty has been offered or signed. First, I want to apologise on behalf of my co-presenters, Robert and Yusuf, who we've struggled a little bit this year to get going, but we're up and back, and hopefully be able to give you the regular sort of content that you, our listeners, want to hear about. So thank you for bearing with us, and be sure to stay tuned. But first of all, we need to talk about Invasion Day and just how important that is for all activists, and particularly people who support the Palestinians, who might not realise the parallels that exist between what happened to the Palestinians in Palestine and the ongoing tragedy, and I call it an ongoing genocide, of what's happening to our Indigenous and First Nations people in Australia. So very importantly, if you're in Melbourne tomorrow, join me and my family and friends, and I expect tens of thousands of other solidarity activists and friends of our Indigenous First Nations people between 11 and 2 p.m. tomorrow, Sunday, the 26th, Invasion Day, at Parliament House in Spring Street. Very, very important for us to send a very big message to those in power that we do not accept that a day that saw 65,000 years of continuous civilization, that we accept that is the day when Australia was discovered. It wasn't. It was a day of tragedy. And to give some of our listeners, we've spoken about this before, the concept, where some of the parallels are. And I found out about this late last year, but we're all, Palestinian supporters understand and know what the Balfour Declaration is, the infamous promising by one person to another person a third person's home. But I'll read that out again. And Lord Balfour offered this to Lord Rothschild. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood, nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. And I found recently a what's called the Letters Patent, and this was signed by King William IV in 1836, February of 1836, and it says eerily that provided always that nothing in those our letters patent contain shall affect or be construed to affect the rights of any Aboriginal natives of the said province to the actual occupation or enjoyment in their own persons or in the persons of their descendants of any lands therein now actually occupied or enjoyed by such natives. Now, I reckon in 180 years since those letters patent, I reckon there's a few natives, in inverted commas, who might say that they have not actually enjoyed their occupation. Sadly, the concept of a superior intellect or society or civilization that is the predication of colonialism and genocide, it continues to exist in that white superiority complex. And if we, importantly to talk about what we base that concept on, the concept of settler colonialism. And we've got a number of different examples. And, if you want to go back to the concept of British India, where you had a very small military force and a huge population, indigenous population. So in British India, they went in, the Brits went into India, with massive violence. Our concept was, we're going to take the resources, we're bringing civilization and religious to the natives, and until such time as the people get the means to expel them. So we saw the independence of India, but obviously the partition of that area into East and West Pakistan, which, Bangladesh, and leaving a festering wound in Kashmir to make sure that there's never any real peace there. So you move beyond the British India sort of concept of settler colonialism. You get the American-Australian model, which is the complete or near complete genocide of the indigenous people. So where in India there were so many Indians that they couldn't kill everybody, well, the 100 million Native Americans that were slaughtered in the march from east to west, and the civilization, inverted commas, of the United States, through to what occurred, as we know, with the hundreds of massacres around Australia of the indigenous people. So you get the complete and near genocide of all peoples. And then you've got the third model, which is the Israeli model, and that's where you kill and ethnically cleanse the land for the sole use of the new colonialist people. And so you have, from the Zionist Irgun and Haganah Stern gang, those terrorist organisations that committed the massacres and the ethnic cleansing that predated 1948 and the creation of the State of Israel. You have a land that is cleansed of its indigenous people. And then you have the South African version. When you fail at Plan A or Plan B, you end up with apartheid. So what you do is you herd the remaining people into an area, and you create reservations or Bantustans. You deprive them of rights and resources, and then you demean, marginalise, create situations that sees them want to flee. And so what you have now in Palestine is, within 48 Palestine, or Israel proper, if you will, 20% of the population that's condensed to within 3% of the land. Their cities and societies and civil infrastructure doesn't get the resources and of similar Jewish neighbourhoods. We haven't had a single Arab town or city opened since the inception of the State of Israel. And you've had hundreds, obviously, of Israeli or Jewish settlements spring up all over, including, obviously, within the West Bank. And so, ultimately, you end up with the situation where we're creating a circumstance that sees the indigenous people seeking to leave. And they seek to leave, in the first instance, to get away from violence. They seek to build a better life for their families and children because those opportunities are denied them within their ancestral homes. Interestingly, I was reading some stuff on genocide and the parallels between the genocide that is ongoing within Australia, remembering that tomorrow's Invasion Day. I would love to see you down at Parliament House. I read something by Bryn Tainhill, and she studies genocide, and more accurately, the conditions that lead up to a genocide, and the common themes and patterns that usually happen within a society to get to this point. And I want you to, as I talk through these points, just think about the parallels that exist today in the language we hear from Morrison, from Boris Johnson, from ScoMo, from the sort of leaders that now exist in the West, a real rightist sort of government, and then compare that. The next level is what we're hearing out of in Israel from Netanyahu and Benny Gantz. Either of those guys is going to be the Prime Minister of the State of Israel come March next year. So the common themes usually happens in economically distressed country with falling standards of living for some people. There's a rise in infant mortality, which is an indicator. The politicians start enacting populist messaging about us and them. The narratives start placing blames on the situation as it exists for us on them. They're less worthy somehow. And we've got to yearn for a mythological past. Remember when it was so great. Make America great again. And this tactic shores up support within this, call it a dog whistle, silent majority or minority. And the others suddenly become, we start calling them criminals and perverts. They're threats to women and children. They're disgusting. They're unworthy of empathy. And anyone who supports these vulnerable minorities is suddenly attacked with, how could you, support these degenerates? And it effectively undercuts the solidarity movement, but also, creates an isolation. So if you're at work and you put up your hand and say, I'm really against Manus or Nauru or, the separation of children by American border guards, you become ostracised and singulated. How can you support these degenerates? Why are they coming here? And so it really takes an emotional toll on those that want to speak, but also is a challenge to us to actually stay firm. So aside from being that challenge, the government then starts modifying the courts to ensure that they can block things. So we've seen, as we know, many different, whether it was the repealing of the Medivac almost immediately upon, one of the first acts of this most new parliament. And so it just makes it that much harder. So in the 20th and 21st century, as far as genocide doesn't really go from zero to all-out slaughter. That doesn't happen in a blink of an eye. Even in Rwanda, we saw the anti-Tutsi propaganda started some 10, 15 years beforehand. The plan for slaughter actually starts taking place in the mid-90s, and countries were just standing around doing nothing, hearing this sort of stuff, but not actually making any commentary. But in countries where there's some sort of ostensibly functional democracy, the phases are slower. First, you've got to start with some propaganda, supported with things like government reporting the crimes committed against people they target. There's public safety measures, be alert, not alarmed. And then we've got to get people, militarise the police forces, revoking basic civil rights. The right to protest suddenly is becoming, whether it's Brisbane climate change, whether it's in Sydney, we had David Shoebridge, a member of Parliament there, arrested for attending Kirribilli House. So we start making things just that little bit harder, just ever so slightly. Then you establish a target group that has less civil rights than every other member of the population. So we start saying, okay, those leftists, whether it was Get Up going up to Queensland and saying we've got to make climate part of the next election. So you're now one of those leftists, go get a job. How come you protest? It's not possible, of course, that some leftist, inverted comma, chose to give up a day of annual leave, chose to take a day out of their life, whether they're studying or working or caring for a family member, and chose because of an importance of a topic to attend a rally or demonstration. They're obviously unwashed, unkept, and homeless or unemployed. They've become othered. So you get that, isolation of those people, and then you start, aside from creating that second class, we now make it harder for them to get education. So let's increase school fees. Let's make HECS even more. Let's monetize universities so that we can dumb down our society. Jobs become scarce. We create, vast zones where the minority might be forbidden, like in the concept of public life. We might then start telling them to wear IDs, so make it very clear for us who the other is. And if this sounds familiar, we're talking eerily like Germany in the 30s. But you should also remember that, Germany in the 30s modelled those laws on US segregation systems. We're talking about the Deep South. police now start harassing and targeting the minorities. You remember the climate change protests last year. We had pictures of police officers, showing white supremacist tags, with EAD, ETA D, on their badges. The police start harassing. They use zealous, militaristic and violent actions to move people on. Again, creating an otherness. And the goal, look, it's to get people not to act. People, and ultimately the population becomes numb to it. So that level of violence becomes something that the vast majority just doesn't see. When you think about Manus and Nauru, and we're coming into 8+ years now, where people who have a humanitarian right to seek asylum, to flee persecution, that we lock them up in not even third world, perhaps even fourth world conditions. So you're creating the situation where people get silenced and they perhaps want to even leave. And this is the beginning of a cultural genocide. The minority disappears and they're left with this really vocal majority. Now, the next steps, how it happens, become irrelevant. Whether it's mass killings, whether it's detentions, whether it's camps, is it killing fields, is it, what happened in Myanmar to the Rohingyas? It just starts happening. You get rising infant mortality, the us versus them mentality, and ultimately, if all this sounds familiar, sounds like something you've heard before, it's the very real reality of an Indigenous person's struggle for rights in their ancestral lands in Australia. It's also the reality of Palestinians in Palestine, and just to by way of commentary, we've got the lawyer, businesswoman Josephine Cashman, who is an Indigenous woman who is, for my taking, one of the worst Indigenous people you might ever listen to, hear or see, where she refers Bruce Pascoe, who many might know as a fabulous Indigenous person and author of Dark Emu. And if you haven't read it, please, get online and get it, buy it, read it, borrow it from your library. She refers Bruce Pascoe to her mate Dutton, who then refers it through to the AFP because she's not sure that he's actually Indigenous and he's profited from Indigenous grants, and so he's received money illegally. Now, we've heard over on Friday into Saturday that the AFP has dropped the investigation. Remember, this woman, Jo Cashman, has referred to Andrew Bolt as an elder. So anybody that could actually do that is immediately, I think, somebody we shouldn't be listening to. And just this week, 40 international world leaders rushed to occupy Jerusalem to express remorse over the Holocaust. And for what happened, 6 million European Jews who were exterminated by the Nazis. They rushed to Jerusalem to say sorry. And they should say sorry, but they should be saying sorry in Europe. They should be saying sorry in Palestine. And they should be saying sorry to the Palestinians for making the Palestinians suffer for the crimes that Europe committed. Israel didn't exist during the Holocaust. There was no Israeli representatives. There was no Israel. We've been having to suffer the pain for it. And these leaders, they came to Yad Vashem, and this takes place only a few kilometres from Deir Yassin, on stolen land, Yad Vashem, on Ain Karam. And the people that were ethnically cleansed from Ain Karam lived just a few miles away, less than 4 hours walk. Less than 4 hours walk in a refugee camp in the West Bank. Did they apologise to them for the creation of the State of Israel that saw these people ethnically cleansed? Less than a kilometre away from the Holocaust Memorial is Deir Yassin, which was one of the number one massacres, if you will, that created or empowered the Zionist terrorist gangs to ethnically cleanse Palestine? Did they visit Deir Yassin and say sorry there to those people? And they know. Of course they know. The Palestinians continue to suffer the sins of Europe. Did they, any one of them, say anything for today's open-air prison, some say concentration camp, that is Gaza, where 2 million people sit imprisoned for now coming into its 12th year? There was no sorry there. No cameras went to take there. No leader, not Macron, not Charles. Nobody went to Gaza. And with all this Holocaust commemoration services, Netanyahu used his time speaking to commemorate the death, and he did say never again, but never again to Jews, not never again to anyone, not never again to Palestine, because he presides over a government that ensures that Palestinians live today in an apartheid state where they're not represented, don't get to vote, are killed, etc. on a daily basis. But he used this as a major platform to call for war against Iran. His speech was riddled with all of the anti-Iran propaganda you might imagine. So really, really sad. And we've only got a few minutes left, and I really want to read something a dear friend of mine, Michaela, wrote last year about what Palestinians should know about Invasion Day. And these are the words of Michaela. I'm struggling to align my thoughts about January 26th, but I want to say a few words in solidarity with the people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, on whose hospitality all of us who are not Indigenous to this land rely, and whose hospitality we and the Australian settler state have serially abused, along with Indigenous lives and property for 231 years and counting. Tomorrow is a day when we are invited to demonstrate our solidarity with First Peoples of this country, to reject a national holiday that celebrates and revives the founding tenets of this modern nation-state: colonialism, land expropriation, genocide and white supremacy, as unchanged and representative of Australia's national and cultural values in 2019. Rejecting the premise of these celebrations does not cure the foundational violence on which Australia was forged, but it does enable us to make a choice about the contemporary values that should be fostered into our future. What happens daily and weekly in Australia is evidence of the sickness at the heart of our government's institutions. We post memes about the number of women killed annually in domestic violence situations, but as someone put to me recently, funding for women in domestic violence literally requires you to be chased around by an axe murderer to qualify. She's not talking figuratively. She was referring to a well-publicised case in Canberra. Someone said to me recently that if we rebranded this as terrorism, it'd be all over in the next 5 minutes. Terrorism doesn't even need fatalities to get funded. It's the more high-profile murders of young women, fewer in number, most recently the murder of a Palestinian woman, Aya Masraoui, to whom an appalling injustice was done by incorrectly identifying who she was. As people fought about this identity, Aya could not be grieved and celebrated. But the contestation and erasure of her identity, when it came to the Australian media, seemed most of all to be that it was a massive inconvenience, because one settler colonial state doesn't want to ask about the apartheid that it unashamedly practiced at law in another settler colonial state, much less acknowledge the identity of people whose presence contradicts that story, because populations with counterclaims keep reminding settler colonial states that they will never not be settler colonial states. Settler colonial states hate to be reminded of who they are. These are not aberrations or attributable to individuals. They are part of the ongoing violence of Australian values and infrastructure, systems that don't adequately fund people in need of protection or care to acknowledge who people are. These stories are mirrored by 2 centuries of atrocity to the Indigenous people of this land. For the most part, these stories are not my stories to tell, yet facing so many urgent issues for which there is insufficient recognition and utterly inadequate funding, it turns out that we do have money for is reenacting historic events that never happened. Quite a bit of money, apparently, nearly $7 million. The markers of violence in this state are part of the ordinary and everyday. In recent years, great interventions have made to highlight the role of Cook or so-called explorers in the colonial project of dispossession and self-aggrandisement on which this state rests. What comes to mind on the eve of national commemoration on our own settler disgrace relates to the practice of naming. The practice of naming is one I'm familiar with in the Palestinian context. That the streets of Tel Aviv are signposted with architects of the state's butchery and dispossession, that people invite me to meet me on those streets without imagining for a moment the anxieties those names provoke to a Palestinian. Australia is no different. In Alice Springs, there is Wilshire Street, named after Constable William Wilshire, who was at the height of Australia's frontier wars responsible for a vast number of Aboriginal deaths in serious violent circumstances. Settler states celebrate their bloodbaths and dishonesty without a trace of shame, and most of us never notice the representational violence that surrounds us. It's celebrated and suppressed, and concurrently, so that we might terrorise one group of people while raising no apprehension in another. Whilst I learned at Wilshire Street, I asked a friend in Alice Springs if it was central. She replied that it wasn't a main one, but it was notorious for its violence. When we speak those names, we naturalise and affirm colonial narrative, but more than that, we reenact the settler colonial complex of violence. We suppress Indigenous narrative, while we naturalise the violence through which white Australia has fought to raise the real holders of title to this land. If we do not reject this disgrace and violence, it's our disgrace and violence. So friends, listeners, be sure to join us tomorrow, 11 to 2 o'clock, State Parliament, to protest Invasion Day. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
G'day listeners, this is Johnny Mack. Be sure to tune in to Invasion Day 2020 broadcast here on 3CR from 9am to 4pm on Sunday 26th of January. 3CR's First Nation broadcasters will bring you black and deadly news, views and music from activists around the country. For more information, check out 3cr.org.au and have a deadly Invasion Day.
I've been moved by the wind upon the waters and the shadows as the leaves are blown. When that old wind moans on a weary winter Sunday, like a friend that keeps on knocking at my home. I've been moved watching nature slowly turning through the seasons and the patterns that she brings. And as the morning star proceeds, the breaking of a new day, you find the black crow is already on the wing. I've been moved by the crying of the newborn, the honey sweetness of the air in spring. I watch the moonlight flood across them sleepy hills and valleys. I heard the sadness in a requiem. I've been moved watching something that's been suffering, be it humankind or any living thing. From the fury of the storm, that old parched ground is reborn, and the desert's blooms that satisfy a king. I've been moved by the tireless sea a churning, or them scarlets of an inland dusk. Oh, when a close friend has died, I turned away and cried as they laid him down and shoveled in the dust.